Welcome to video 2. In this video, our experts will provide a brief overview of historical and cultural information and discuss its implications for your practice with families. First, though, we'll cover a brief history of how Afghan newcomers arrived to Minnesota. In August of 2021, the U.S. made the decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. The subsequent Taliban takeover that happened nearly immediately created an untenable and unsafe situation for many Afghan families. In response to this emergency, the U.S. launched Operation Allies Welcome, a 6-month effort that began with a rapid 17-day air evacuation of 84,600 Afghans directly to 8 U.S. military bases. From the bases, states could directly resettle Afghan newcomers under humanitarian parole status, which grants refugee benefits to these families, but also requires them to navigate an extensive asylum process once they're resettled. Minnesota worked quickly to resettle 1,260 Afghans between September of 2021 and February of 2022. We start this conversation with our experts at the beginning of summer 2023 by simply asking, how's it been going?
Yes, there's definitely a lot of Afghans that have come to the U.S. in the past year and a half. My understanding is almost 90,000 people have come in the past year and a half. They've been spread up across the country. There are Afghans in smaller states, and there's also a lot of Afghans in well-known states where there's already been establishment of Afghans, like in California or Virginia or in Texas. And there's this chatter around the community that some of these folks have heard about the resources that Minnesota has versus some of these other states. And they might be interested in coming and seeing, what Minnesota can provide and help them, adjust to life in the U.S. versus, let's say going up in North Dakota and South Dakota, which I think might be a little more difficult for some of these Afghans.
I think it really depends, right? Afghanistan is a large country. It's hard to generalize. The folks that I have been in communication with, really, I think what it boils down to is if they were from the city, they were used to everything being in really close proximity, easy to access, very walkable. Minnesota is not really any of those things. Even if they do live in the city, their winter climate is much milder, probably more comparable to like a Washington, D.C. winter than to this kind of a winter. And so I think a lot of the shock is everything is so far away. It's so difficult to do very basic things here. Everything is so unnecessarily confusing, which really comes up frequently. And then just this isn't really exactly what I thought it was going to be. I think also landing in Minnesota, they may have had family that lives in other areas with much larger Afghan communities, California being one of them, Washington, D.C., Virginia being another one. And those are highly populated, very expensive places to be, and it's not very likely that they'll be able to make their way there quite yet. That might be something that they choose to do eventually, but it's really like, how do we make Minnesota home for you and make this accessible and reasonable for you to, accommodate your needs and your family's needs here? I think for the kids too, school has been quite the shock. School, the amount of time American children spend in school, that is not really mirrored anywhere else in the world. They spend double or triple the amount of time in school here than they did back home. And so it's very different. And while I think that they find it exciting, I think they also find that it's very challenging.
Next, we wanted to understand some basic history that influences our work with Afghan families.
Yeah, so Afghanistan has colonial borders. Those borders were created by the British in the south and by the Soviet Republic from the north. There were a lot of different ethnic groups and cultural groups that were kind of forced to live together within these borders. For most of its history, it worked. But for the past 40-something years, it has not. Yeah, Afghanistan has been in war since 1979, nonstop. It's been, the Soviet occupation, then the American occupation, and a lot of civil war in between all of that as well. A lot of people have died. It's caused a lot of trauma. It's caused a lot of PTSD. Some of these folks are born into war, so all they know is war as well, which has created a lot of mistrust within different communities in Afghanistan. So understand that some of these folks are dealing with a lot. I remember when I first came to the U.S., the idea of fireworks, firecrackers, or even thunder scared the living hell out of me. Whenever I would hear thunder, I would go hide into a room. Even as a 20-something-year-old, it would still scare me, but I wouldn't show it because obviously I didn't want to be seen as somebody who was scared of thunder. But even fireworks to this day make me jump. So keep in mind, people that came from war, either one, it won't even impact them, they won't even notice those sounds going off, or two, it might make them very jumpy. So little things like this, for people who've come from war, can have a very different impact for than folks who grew up in the U.S. Because of all this war, it's created a lot more tension between different cultural groups. Afghanistan has multiple cultures, but the three largest ones are the Pashtuns, which are mostly in the south, the Tajiks that are mostly in the north, and the Hazaras that are mostly in the center part of Afghanistan. The Tajiks and the Hazaras mostly speak Farsi, but in today's day and age, a lot of people also call it Dari. Dari is just another dialect of Farsi, but because of some tension between Afghanistan and Iran, people in Afghanistan have wanted to differentiate the two different languages and two different cultures, so they're calling it Dari more so than Farsi. But also keep in mind, when you bring an interpreter from Iran, a lot of these folks from Afghanistan are going to have a harder time understanding them, just because in a world where there's not much mass media, a different dialect still sounds very foreign to you, right? But because in the West, we have mass media where somebody from Spain will also hear the same dialect as somebody from Mexico. It's easier for them to understand because they have some kind of familiarity with it. But in Afghanistan, there is no such thing. So even a different dialect might sound very foreign to some of them.
Afghanistan has two primary languages. There's going to be Dari, which is a dialect of Farsi, and then there's Pashto. There's also like tribal variations, regional variations. It can sound more like Iranian Farsi, or it can sound like, kind of like a Pakistani version of Pashto. It really depends on where they lived. People from the major city are going to be speaking a more Americanized version of those languages, or they may have already had exposure to English as well. So taking translation services into perspective with this, I would say, know your translator's limitations. How long have they been in the States? Things have changed there in the last 30 years since they probably started living and working here. They might have limitations to what they're able to convey in terms of messaging that is more detailed or complicated, or just doesn't exist in our language because it didn't exist in our country. Some translator services blanket the language of Farsi and Dari as one language. And so they will send an Iranian Farsi speaking interpreter. And it's not to throw shade, it's just not the same language. There are differences in the language, nuances, pronunciation, words that are used entirely differently. And so a translator like that, I'm not saying that they're not useful. They have their time and their place. Doctor's appointments, intake for, very simple services, a phone call, they can translate for sure on minor things. On a major thing like immigration, child protection, something more serious, somebody who actually speaks the language fluently, reads and writes fluently, and maybe even has a long history of translatory experience, a real professional is required. There's always the national language line. I feel like a lot of companies use the language line. I think language line is also, you have that high probability of getting an Iranian Farsi speaking translator, potentially not an Afghan Dari speaking translator or Farsi Dari dialect speaking translator. I would probably point folks in the direction of the Afghan Cultural Society. They're familiar with a lot of people that actually can provide translation services or could point you in the right direction for how to access those folks.
Our next video will shift from implications to application and look at how to best greet, communicate, and join with families.